Roger, Dr. Trevathan, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Well, first I want to give a hand. Thank you, Dr. Trevathan, for being our first guest and speaking with us about your interesting life. And I want to give you a hand for you are a highly respected Pitt County citizen, but again, I'm interested in your insights because of your life. Being a former pediatrician here, you've seen so much, known about so many troubled times of trying to get health for children and health for the community. And so first of all, we're going to begin our little talk of stuff. Give me a biography, a little something about yourself so we all know who you are.
I didn't know I was shy, but I think I am. If I had been invited to come down to Sheppard Library and face an old man in a rocking chair with a microphone, I'd have turned around and headed home. That's one dangerous weapon in our society. If you're past 80 and allow somebody to speak, whoo, they go forever. But anyway, I hope that since this is the beginning of this sort of dialogue or monologue, that it'll be worthwhile. I've never felt my life was that special because I'm sure about what I tell you about me, you can replicate it in your own life and just not realize maybe the value or the interest it might be for however it's recorded or whatever. I often think if someone had just done this for my grandfather, what I would have known and what I have desperately searched for all the years trying to dig up something about, to me, a very interesting man and men, my two grandfathers.
What were their names?
Henry Calhoun Turnage and George Gold Trevathan were my grandfathers. My grandfather Trevathan was a Primitive Baptist minister, and he could talk to you all for 3 hours, so I didn't inherit that part, I'm sure. But anyway, they were interesting men. I was born, getting to the birth thing.
This is for them.
I was born in Tarboro at home with Dr. Raby delivering me, and he delivered many, so there might be many.
Thereafter, they're not talking loud enough.
You might want to speak up. We've got some folks that have...
Hearing aids?
Yes. There you go.
All right. Well, anyway, I was born in Tarboro, delivered at home by Dr. Raby on St. David Street. My mother and father had married the year before in Fountain in a double wedding. Mother's youngest sister married Dr. Edgar Lane from Pine Tops, and my mother married Earl Trevathan, who was in the Ford Motor Company business in Tarboro, and that's where they built a house and where I was born and lived the first 7.5 years of my life. I remember all the kids up and down the street, and I remember that beautiful commons in Tarboro and what that did to the community in terms of play activities and events in that beautiful park. You know, I've sort of had a passion for park space in most of my life, and thinking how hard it would be to push for more and more of that in this city. We are improving, but we need it. Anyway, in first grade there, and at that time, the things I remember most were the fact that I had 4 living grandparents and 10 living aunts and uncles within 20 miles of our house. So we had family. That wasn't unusual. All of my relatives were married within 8 or 10 miles of the area, from Jonas Crossroads to Tarboro to Rocky Mount. So relatives were all about, and that was certainly the community I grew up in. My first sweetheart was named Ruth Bond, and I was in 2nd grade. The only trouble was all the other boys liked her too, and I lost out on that one very early in life. But, these first few years of my life were, in my parents' mind, were the flapper years, the early 20s, when things were quite prosperous. And some of the activities that went on that I remember, of course, were sledding along the street being pulled by an automobile sitting in a rocking chair, and these runners would be we don't get cold weather anymore, so we can't do that. I also, being a firstborn, was quite mischievous. They tell me when I was 4 years old, I took a bucket of red paint and painted the garage door of my dad's garage red. Well, anyway, you imagine I got some punishment for it, but the punishment was unique. Dad, he admonished me for it, but then he took his pencil and wrote on that white barn, "Dear Santa, little Earl has been bad, and remember that at Christmas." That's the most formidable punishment anybody could ever get. Why didn't they beat me? But not that. Mother also told me when I was 3 years old that Dad got a new big box full of biddies, chickens. Do you know the word biddies? I grew up with that. I don't know whether that's still a legitimate word or not. Well, I was fascinated by them, but so one day I was in Dad's little chicken house thing there, and I walked around and stomped a few of those little things. And, you know, they should have known right away that some pathology there, and they had that further investigated, but that's one of the early stories of my life. Another event, which you might see the character of which I had to grow up under, there was a contest. They don't call them beauty contests, they call them baby contests on the stages of the elementary school in downtown Tarboro. And all these little guys and girls were dressed all up with their adoring parents all in the audience and put on the stage. Well, the prize was a big tin bathtub. And we did our little stuff, whatever we were supposed to do, but I sidelined myself to investigate that tub. I found a little rake, nothing plastic in those days, metal. I turned the tub over and started beating that through the whole service. Well, anyway, when it was all over, not my anything other than, I guess, my forward behavior, I won the child's contest. And that little tub went home with me, and I got pictures of it to verify. But they're just some things I remember about childhood. The beautiful part of my life occurred when I was 4.5 years old. That's a separation beyond the jealousy, envy complex of competing siblings, but my brother was born, and he came at an age when I could love him and enjoy him and tease him, pick on him and all that, and I did all of the above. But anyway, Tarboro, and then I think we'll say a little more about Fountain later.
Yeah.
All right, but I know, the next, I thought of 4 big epic periods in my life, and one would have been the Great Depression. We're not going into that right now, but I'll at least tell you a scheme of my thinking. The Great Depression, then World War II, then the issues of integration of our society, and then the globalization and technology of modern times. And they just seem like kind of big waves in my life, big events, and so I reflect on it that way. But anyway, going back to Fountain, and then
You graduated from Fountain, did you?
yeah, I graduated from high school in Fountain. We had 11 years at that time, and my parents were very conscious of education, always had been, and all of my mother's siblings went to college. My grandfather didn't go to college, but he went to Horner Academy in 1867, right after the Civil War. So education was very important. But anyway, Fountain High School, I went to Fork Union Military Academy for a year, went to Carolina, and in December the 7th, my first year there, a big event happened when Pearl Harbor occurred. The following spring, most all of us jumped somewhere to get ahead of the draft, or at least to go and sign up into service so we could have a little bit more education. So I signed up for the Navy V-12 program, which allowed me for another year of study. I was considering pre-med at the time, and the end of that year, I went to midshipman school at Columbia University. They were preparing officers at that time for the invasion of Europe, D-Day, and I didn't qualify because of my eyes and vision. And before I graduated, I was taken out of the military. I'm at the Midshipman's Officers Training Program and went to Sampson, New York. A time of great despondency on my part. It turned out to be one of the most wonderful and fortunate events of my life. Because see, being in pre-med, I went right straight into the hospital corps and got pharmacy training. I'm at hospital pharmacist mate training in San Diego, and from there Bethesda, Maryland, where I worked in tropical medicine. And in the spring of 1944, 44, I was sent to Pensacola, Florida, to work with tropical diseases, malaria, and other problems that we were seeing in this country with the veterans returning from the South, from the Pacific. That's beside the point. I met a beautiful little wave there from Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming. And guess what? Yes, she liked me. So we had several months of courtship, which involved working all week but having Santa Rosa Island on the white beaches of Florida for the weekends. I had a Jeep, which I, of course, absconded and broke all rules, but I sure did show off in front of her, having a Jeep. An interesting sidelight. I've told this story before, but it's sure worth telling again because I enjoy it. I ran a VD clinic on the weekends as part of your duty, you know. And I looked up one day to a client, and he recognized me, and I recognized him. But I took care of his illness. I gave him enough sulfur so he, passed blood and all that, and he got over his disease. But I found out he was the officer's cook. And he said, "I'm going to pay you back." He didn't put it in those words. But from then on, every few weeks, he'd bring me a sirloin steak with Brookfield butter. World War I, you've never heard of such a thing. That you couldn't find a steak. You never saw any butter. Well, there I was. If you don't think that didn't impress Ruth, I knew I had her by that time. Anyway, I put a ring on her finger, and the courtship was the next year at sea in the South Pacific. My Navy career was not heroic. I've got a few badges, but it just showed you where I'd been and what I'd done. And I don't even qualify to refer to it, thinking of many people around this community who did so much and risked so much for our victory in World War II. But anyway, being engaged, we married after the war, and Ruth's father was National Park Service, as you might wonder why she was from Grand Teton National Park. I guess you know that park. I'd never heard of it till I saw it then, and it's one of the prettiest parks in America. But we were married in Chicago, where her father was with the Department of Interior at that time, moving from the park to the Park Service headquarters. And then my first 3 summers, after returning to Carolina and getting into medical school, were to work with the Blue Ridge Parkway as a park ranger. I mentioned that to Roger, and he sort of...
I had no idea.
But it was not only a great summer job, as you can imagine, but it sure fulfilled some of my linkage and great compassion for the outdoors. I was, as I would mention if we referred more back to my youth, one of the real joys of my life was the Boy Scout program. And if it means today, or can mean today, what it meant to me as a youth, it's just something that is irreplaceable in terms of what my scouting experience provided for me. And then to get a parkway job, and at that time return to Carolina and go 2 years, and where, by the way, one of my classmates is sitting here today. He ought to be up here at this microphone when it comes to the history of Greenville. Dr. Ed Monroe, classmate of mine. And I have 2 years transferring from Chapel Hill to the University of Colorado, where we got our MD. Some of you might not know that Carolina in 1951 moved into a 4-year school. Before that it was just 2 years, and you had to transfer to another state school or into another state for your last 2 years. Ed and I were also in Richmond as an internship program, rotating internship. And then in 1954, I came to Greenville. A couple of reasons. One, I kind of wanted to get back home. Are we doing all right?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Jumping around the world. I wanted to get back home to Greenville. I went to Eastern Carolina. And that wasn't easy to know where to come to, and it wasn't easy to be accepted. These towns in this state, and especially around here, Rocky Mount, Tarboro, Goldsboro, Wilson, were all little enclaves of private ownership, and they were group practices, and you had to be invited in. You would have no hospital privileges if you didn't belong to the Boyce Willis Clinic in Rocky Mount, or the Herring Clinic in Wilson. You remember those? They had the little hospitals, and that's where all of our medical care was. There was only one area in this part of the state, of the cities this size, that was open, and that was Greenville. Now that suited me because I liked Pitt County and this was home. So I elected to come to Greenville under the urge of Dr. Malene Irons. I don't think I'd ever come here if it hadn't been for her. She had an enormous practice and begged me to come here to practice and advised me to come on my own and not pair up as a partner with her. I think that was pretty wise advice too, because she had 3 growing boys and a husband, and her style of practice would have not exactly blended with mine. Not that it was a question of quality, but she just had a lot of things pulling at her, and so she helped me get into practice and start practice here at that time. Well, that's a period of life that's some of the discussion.
Well, talk to us a little bit about Dr. Haar.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Haar came in about 1932 to practice with Dr. Tom Watson. Does anybody remember Dr. Watson and ever heard of him? Somebody? Yes. He was well known throughout the state. He was one of 9 pediatricians in the whole state of North Carolina at that time. Sid Berry in Wilmington, Rook in Raleigh. It's kind of like, legendary names stuck around the state. Well, Dr. Watson was one of them. He died far premature. His son, by the way, Charles Watson, died within the last 3 or 4 months. I read about it down in Southern Pines where he was living. It was Dr. Watson's son. Dr. Haar came and joined him in practice, and he was pulled out of service because Greenville needed a pediatrician, and he got permission to come out of service in Arizona and come here and open and join in with Dr. Watson, and he did. Dr. Haar was pre-antibiotic. I know you don't know what that means, but it does have a lot to do with your approach to diseases and your sort of manner of practice. He was the most diligent, hard-working person I've ever worked around. His day started at 8 o'clock making rounds and ended usually at 11 at night. And he did it all by himself. His vacation was to go down one afternoon at Bayview and sit in a rocking chair for 2 hours and rock, and then come back to Greenville and go to work. You knew Dr. Haar, didn't somebody here know him? But probably your pediatrician. But he was available. He served his community in an enormous fashion, and I don't think probably he's ever been quite recognized for what he was worth.
Now, wasn't his office in the State Bank?
Yeah, in that triangular-shaped building up there at 5 Points, up on the 3rd floor. And to go up there, you had to get in this rickety elevator and pull that squeaky door to, and it would rattle all the way up. kids would go hysterical. Not from the elevator, but they knew that was where they were headed, to Dr. Parr's office, and get a shot. And I had many a person tell me how frightening it was to them, knowing whatever. But anyway, then that corner was changed, the building was torn down, and Dr. Parr worked till the morning of his 87th year. And he died while he was getting ready to leave to go to the emergency room to see a patient. His practice slacked off. Melina Irons, as dynamic as she was smart enough to get out of practice and go into the development evaluation clinic work. After I got partners that began to come in, Dr. Fletcher, Dr. Erkman, and Shapley later. Now these are contemporaries, so you probably know.
Well, talk to us about, now you've set up practice here, and you and I guess the other doctors got the Pitt Pavilion, Pitt Medical Pavilion here. Talk about that. And
well, by this time, I think Greenville being open, and a lot of veterans had the GI Bill that went right into specialty training. Ed Monroe did. When he left Medical College of Virginia, he went to Chapel Hill and did internal medicine. Dr. Longino and several other, Dr. Wooten, all came in the next 2 or 3 years to set up specialty practices, board-certified physicians. And being an open city, Greenville suddenly became more of a medical attractive community, I think, than any other in Eastern Carolina. We had an open hospital, a Hill Burton Hospital. Senators Burton from Alabama and Hill from somewhere else in the United States Senate established the Hill Burton Hospital Act. And Pitt County was one of the early communities in which the physicians offered to abandon their little hospital over on Rotary Street or somewhere over there in the east end of Greenville and accept federal money to build a new hospital. 1950, a Hill Burton Hospital was opened here. I think that was the door that opened this community to modern medicine. And it took a few years for some of the other cities to do so. That's when Dr. Jenkins, Leo Jenkins, got a little bug in his ear that if we're going to have all these specialists come into Greenville, we ought to start a medical school. We don't want to go into that, do we?
well, we'll just keep.
Well, anyway, guide me on.
Well, again, I wanted you to talk about George Massamoto and getting the pavilion.
Oh, well, we had our practices here, but we were in buildings along Main Street, along Evans Street, and I was in a radio studio, and some of them were in the medical arts buildings, and Dr. White was in the Tedderton building. And Ed, were you in the Tedderton building somewhere? Huh?
Yes.
Yeah, we had little plywood buildings, and squeaky doors and small space and electric fans.
It was not a garage at that point.
At that point. Now, why did we have that? I tell you, we came here with empty pockets, most of us. And banks sort of, can you believe it? They weren't too impressed with a doctor. I couldn't get any money. Even, we had to be meager. Being in a radio studio, we built my own tables and put up walls. And since it was soundproof, it was good for pediatrics. Nobody could hear those children screaming.
Did you get paid with moonshine?
No, I'd have taken it though if I could have. This is pre getting into the medical pavilion, but Dr. Ray Menges rented that building. He encouraged me to come to Greenville. And did you know he gave me 3 months rent free? He came over and sat down in my little office and said, I know what it's like. I mean, I don't know what it's like to have nothing, but I know you all have come here and going to work and you need some help. So you get 3 months behind you and then you can pay me rent. the nature of that Minges family. So many things they've done like that that show how much generosity and community interest and concern he has. I'll never forget Ray Minges for that little bit of boost he gave me when we started. But anyway, as we got together as friends with Monroe and Longino and others, we wanted to build a better facility. We met, talked it over, and decided we needed an architect, and we didn't know who to go. So I think Ed or somebody said, let's go to Raleigh to the School of Design and Architecture at State College and get someone there. The chairman of that department, who's well known, and I haven't thought of his name yet, but anyway, buildings are named after him up there, suggested Mr. George Matsumoto, who was Japanese. Matter of fact, he grew up in the camps outside of Sacramento and California during World War I, where all Japanese citizens were sent. And he had done some interesting work in Raleigh, and he helped, he designed our building, and with Gene West Company, P.S. West Construction Company, and they built the medical pavilion. At that time it was, and it still is, a very substantial building. That's where we all got started. From then on, it was just the medical provisions, the doctor populations, and all those things have just grown. But I think going into medical situations and all is another
Well,
thing.
that George Matsumoto is just had a PBS special on him, and he's very well known for his modern architecture in the 50s, and he's like a premier architect in North Carolina. And I did not know this until talking to Dr. Trevathan, that Greenville has a piece of his architecture. So that's a fascinating thing. So let's talk about the three big issues: the downtown redevelopment and the civil unrest, the mergers of the schools and desegregation, and the formation, the idea of the medical school with Dr. Ernest Ferguson that we talked about. So first, talk about the downtown redevelopment.
In the early 1960s, the federal government started a program of slum clearance and downtown redevelopment. And Greenville, through Mayor Gene West, applied for grants to do a study because we had some blighted areas in this city. You all go look at town commons now. If you've never seen pictures of what Tom, you know what I'm talking about. It was a pile of rubbish, oyster shells, tin cans, and houses that were barely standing up, full of people.
Rented for $5 a week, no bathrooms.
And a lot of it, I was told, was outside of town ownership. Somebody's inherited it and lived in Maryland or whatever, so they didn't care. The incentive to do some redevelopment and redesign and reconstruction of this town was not hard to come by. It was hard to move around this town. My grandfather used to come from Pine Tops and parked at the old pavilion site out there across the street and sit there and wait for me to come to get him to drive him to my house. Over the 18 feet wide streets. And look at downtown, you know, it's almost underdone. So I was enthusiastic about this project of redevelopment in this town. Well, that's a long part of history, a major section of issues in this city, but it became quite controversial. Not the need for redevelopment or the need for destroying housing, subhuman housing, and all of that were not, everybody was in favor of that, but it was a method for doing it. To bring in the federal government and to do the redevelopment thing, you had to condemn property, and that is an ugly word, private rights and all that. So it brought up a strong political persuasion in the citizens of this town, and we were divided, nearly even. And it went to such fever that I'm sure it broke up a lot of friendships or whatever, but not for me. But it was that time that was so much political unrest about the issue of public housing. But anyway, I volunteered to run for city council, as did Mr. Hartwell Campbell with WNCT television. You see his son article in the paper every Sunday, Tom Campbell. He was well known in the radio and television business. Dr. Brimley of university faculty, and Mr. John Howard, a tobacconist here in town, and I ran for the city council to get this issue resolved and to have a referendum vote on it. And we won, and Mr. West was reelected mayor, and things happened, and we lived peacefully ever after. But we do have a town commons that's clean. We've got public housing here and there that has served a purpose, and Greenville has been struggling ever since to do this and upgrade this and to build parks and to put a transportation center down here on Evans Street and to widen and do all those things that were quite issues back long ago.
Let's talk about the merger of schools, then, desegregation.
All right. Greenville's record has been pretty good in resolving integration problems. I felt involved mostly in the medical community. So many things were overtly obvious and unfair with segregation as it was, and that was a good place to start in this city of integrating the community. I can remember we formed a mental health unit here in this town to support mental health activities. J.B. Spillman was chairman. And we had a luncheon to bring some out-of-city people to help us get organized. One of the ladies was black. We were going to have our little luncheon at the Silo restaurant. The management there, like every other place in Greenville, said we would love to have her, but it's just something we haven't started in Greenville, and we would deny you're having the dinner here with the black person. A member of our committee took her home and fed her lunch while we had our meeting. And we all knew that was wrong, terrible. So it was that's the mental picture I felt. It's time to do something. We had the Supreme Court decision in '54, but it was 10 years later, nearly, before we began to fulfill the promise to get integrated, segregation abolished. And Greenville this whole area went through some tough times. And again, it would exhaust you to hear all the details of things that went on, but...
Well, how did it deal with you being a pediatrician, though, and caring for black children?
Well, before integration, black children would come in my back door at that radio studio and have a seat in the hallway. And since my practice was up the front side of the building, they'd ruffle their feet or bang on the wall to let somebody know they were there. My nurse would go back to check the child out and see if she was all right, or if it was something urgent. Practice in those days, you never knew what you were going to pull back the blanket and what you were going to see. It was rather primitive. So we were segregated at that time. That was only 2 or 3 years, because we quickly, by 1958, started the pavilion, and it had no segregated facilities at all. All of us knew it was wrong, and we began to desegregate our own offices. The hospital had some similar troubles, and would you believe it was over my putting a premature in a white isolate equipment which could better be used to stabilize temperature and manage that child. I was told by the administrator of the hospital that the Board of Trustees just wouldn't allow that to happen, and you would have to use a facility in the segregated, the black nursery. So that stirred Dr. Irons up and stirred me up, and from that time on we went through many gyrations because we knew we were winning. And the hospital with the help of Dr. Best, more than anybody I know, and Dr. Ray Minges and Dr. Malene Irons, moved into integrating the hospital with the approval of the Board of Trustees. There was a lot of argument about what to do and so forth, but I don't think anybody was strongly objecting to it, but everybody was afraid to put their first foot into that issue. You wouldn't believe all those things, but taking a child from Greenville to Durham in an ambulance. There were no ambulances. You used hearses, funeral home hearses, for white children. And just to keep it segregated, the local funeral home would call the blacks and beg them to use one of their ambulances, I reckon even to pay for the gas, so they could go to Durham for some special needs, needing an ambulance in the hearse belonging to a black funeral home. They were some of the ridiculous little issues we had to deal with. The only place that was integrated early in the Pitt Memorial Hospital was the morgue. Nobody in there complained, I guess.
Well, talk to us now for a little bit about the idea of the medical school, and you mentioned Dr. Ernest Ferguson.
The first time I'd ever heard the idea of a medical school here in Greenville, I was at a Christmas cocktail hour with Bruce somebody, Ed, who's in the art department. And Nancy, you remember Ed? Who was the...
I'm sorry, I dozed off.
You watch these old people, put you up here. Bruce somebody who was head of the art department. We had Bruce, he's got a son here. Huh?
Bruce Carter?
No, it wasn't him. Big old fellow with a mustache. Anyway, we were there at a cocktail party, and Dr. Jenkins was sitting
Was
in...
it Dr.
Gray, who said it? Wellington Gray. Dr. Wellington Gray. I don't give him credit for anything, but we just had to be at his house where I heard that Jenkins mention the medical school. I don't know when Ed first heard it, but when I heard that, you know, I turned my head sideways and snickered. I said, poor Jenkins, he's just failed on getting the Dixie Clinic basketball program down here. That went belly up in a hurry. And now he's jumped on a medical school. God, the man's crazy. Well, anyway, he wasn't crazy. Ed didn't think he was. And a year or two later, we were beginning to tackle legislative issues and making some headway. And nobody on earth knows more about it than Ed Monroe, so I won't even enter into what he has experienced and what it was like. But it was a laborious, difficult journey. And for those who come later in the life of this town, need to know, whether they could ever feel it or not, how much energy and time and work and sacrifice and slaps and pains occurred to get things like that done. I went through a little of it as on the city council. I guess I'm the only, and the wives too, I guess I'm the only person that has ever had an ad in the paper against me double. You open the paper this way, the title went all the way across 2 pages. What's Up, Doc? With Bugs Bunny stuff all down the side. Because I had written a letter supporting the redevelopment thing downtown and what I thought we ought to support as citizens. But you ran into a lot of very tough times. All was worth it, and nobody got hurt. But anyway, there's some of the building blocks on this town, and the memory of it is along with me. Give me another.
Well, I think it's our first hour is done. What we're going to do...
You gonna give them a chance to go home if they want?
No!